My tablet recording caught my stepmother coaching my kids to say I abandoned them. I was cleaning out my daughter's backpack on a Thursday evening when I found my old tablet wedged between her math workbook and a stack of crumpled permission slips. The device had been missing for 3 weeks, and I'd assumed it had been left at school or lost during one of our weekend trips to the park. The battery was dead, so I plugged it into the charger on my kitchen counter and went back to making dinner, not thinking much about it until the screen lit up an hour later with 17 notifications from the voice memo app. I didn't even know that app was still active on the device. My hands were covered in spaghetti sauce when I noticed the alerts, and I almost ignored them completely. But something about the timestamp on the most recent recording made my stomach tighten. It was from yesterday at 3:45 p.m., exactly the time my stepmother Vivian had been watching the kids while I was at a client presentation across town. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked up the tablet, tapping the first notification without really knowing what to expect. Maybe the kids had been playing with the recording feature, making silly voices or pretending to be radio hosts like they sometimes did. The audio started playing through the small speaker, and for the first few seconds, all I heard was rustling fabric and distant footsteps. Then Vivian's voice came through crystal clear, that particular tone she used when she was being serious with the children, and what she said made me drop the tablet onto the counter like it had burned my fingers. "Now, Sophie, when the lady asks you about your daddy, you need to tell her he's never home. Say he leaves you alone all the time, and you're scared when he goes away. Can you practice that for Grandma?" My 6-year-old daughter's voice responded, small and uncertain. "But Daddy doesn't leave us alone. You're always here when he works." Vivian's reply came fast and sharp in a way that made my jaw clench. "That's not the right answer, sweetheart. The truth is that Daddy would leave you alone if Grandma wasn't here to save you. He doesn't care about you and your brother the way I do. Now try again. What do you say when the lady asks?" Sophie's second attempt was quieter, more hesitant, and I could hear the confusion in her voice as she repeated the words Vivian wanted. "Daddy leaves us alone and I'm scared." The audio captured Vivian's satisfied hum, then her voice addressing my 4-year-old son. "Good girl. Now Liam, your turn. Tell Grandma what Daddy does when he gets mad." I stood in my kitchen listening to my stepmother systematically coaching my children to lie about abuse that never happened, and every word felt like a physical blow to my chest. The recording went on for 38 minutes, during which Vivian created an entire narrative of neglect and emotional abuse that had no basis in reality whatsoever. She told Sophie to say I'd forgotten to feed them dinner multiple times. She instructed Liam to claim I'd locked him in his room as punishment for minor infractions. She practiced responses with both kids about how sad and scared they felt living with me, correcting them when their answers didn't sound convincing enough. At one point, Sophie started crying and said she didn't want to lie about Daddy because it felt bad, and Vivian's response was to tell her that sometimes telling stories was necessary to protect the people we love, and that Grandma knew what was best for everyone. I'd been a single father for 18 months, ever since my wife Natalie died in a car accident that shattered our family and left me struggling to figure out how to raise 2 young children alone while managing my architectural firm. Vivian had been Natalie's stepmother from a second marriage her father entered when Natalie was already in college, so their relationship had always been somewhat distant and formal rather than genuinely maternal. When Natalie died, Vivian had appeared at our house within hours of the funeral, offering to help with the kids and insisting that I needed support during such a difficult time. I'd been grateful initially because I was drowning in grief and responsibility, barely functioning enough to get Sophie to first grade and keep Liam fed and clothed. Vivian had moved into our guest room temporarily, which somehow became permanently as the months passed, and I kept accepting her offers to stay longer. Looking back now with this recording playing in my kitchen, I could see all the red flags I'd been too exhausted and grief-stricken to notice at the time. The way Vivian had gradually inserted herself into every aspect of our household routines, from meal planning to bedtime schedules, to which activities the kids participated in after school, how she'd started making comments about my parenting choices, subtle criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions about how I should spend more time at home or consider a less demanding career. The increasing frequency with which she'd mentioned that the kids seemed anxious or unhappy when I was around. Observations that never matched what I saw when I was actually with Sophie and Liam. She'd been building a narrative for months, planting seeds of doubt about my capabilities as a father, and I'd been too trusting and too overwhelmed to recognize the pattern. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I listened to the second recording, then the third, my dinner burning on the stove while I stood frozen by the counter. Each audio file revealed another coaching session, another rehearsal of lies designed to paint me as neglectful and emotionally abusive. Vivian had apparently been using the tablet to record these sessions herself, probably as a way to track the kids' progress in learning their fabricated stories, never imagining that I'd find the device and discover what she'd been doing. The fourth recording included a conversation between Vivian and someone else, a woman whose voice I didn't recognize, but who Vivian addressed as Ms. Thornton. They discussed scheduling a home visit and interviewing the children, using language that sounded official and legal in ways that made my blood run cold. "The children are ready," Vivian said on the recording. "I've been preparing them for weeks, and they understand what they need to say. Sophie is naturally dramatic, so she'll be convincing. Liam is young enough that people will assume he's just repeating what he's experienced. Once you file the report with the court, we should be able to move forward with the emergency custody petition. Ms. Thornton responded with concerns about the timeline and whether the evidence would be substantial enough, but Vivian assured her that emotional abuse was harder to prove, which meant it was also harder to disprove, and that the children's testimony combined with her own observations as a concerned grandmother would be more than sufficient to demonstrate that I was unfit to maintain custody. I had to sit down because my legs weren't supporting me properly anymore. This wasn't just bad judgment or misguided concern from an over-involved stepmother. This was a calculated conspiracy to take my children away from me using fabricated allegations of abuse. Vivian had recruited outside help, possibly a lawyer or social worker, and they'd been planning this for weeks, if not months, while I'd been going about my daily routine completely oblivious to the fact that my parental rights were being actively targeted for termination. The recordings were dated over a 3-week period, showing a systematic progression from initial coaching sessions to refined performances to finalizing the logistics of whatever legal action they were planning to take against me. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat in my home office going through every interaction I'd had with Vivian over the past 18 months, trying to understand what her endgame was and why she wanted to destroy my relationship with my children. Money seemed like an obvious possibility since Natalie had left a substantial life insurance policy, and the kids were the beneficiaries with me as trustee until they turned 18. Control was another potential motivation, because Vivian had always been someone who needed to manage and direct the people around her, and maybe she saw this as her chance to finally have the family she'd never quite achieved through her marriage to Natalie's father. Or maybe it was something darker and more psychological, some twisted need to replace the stepdaughter she'd lost by claiming that stepdaughter's children as her own. I spent hours researching family law and custody rights, learning about how allegations of abuse were investigated and what evidence was typically required to remove children from a parent's home. What I found was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. The reassuring part was that courts generally required substantial proof before terminating parental rights, and emotional abuse was indeed difficult to prove without documentation or witness testimony. The terrifying part was that allegations alone could trigger investigations, temporary custody modifications, and supervised visitation requirements that would devastate my children and damage my professional reputation, even if the claims were eventually proven false. If Vivian's plan succeeded even partially, I'd be fighting an uphill battle against a system designed to protect children, but sometimes weaponized by manipulative adults with hidden agendas. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in the dark trying to develop a strategy for protecting my kids and myself from what was coming. Confronting Vivian directly felt dangerous because she'd just deny everything or claim I'd misunderstood the recordings, and she might accelerate her timeline if she knew I was onto her scheme. Going to the police seemed premature since technically no crime had been committed yet, just planning and coaching that hadn't resulted in any formal accusations. I needed legal advice from someone who understood family law and could help me navigate this situation before it exploded into a full custody battle. At 6:30 in the morning, I started calling family law attorneys, leaving voicemails with 3 different firms explaining that I needed an emergency consultation about fraudulent abuse allegations and custody interference. Attorney Rebecca Winters called me back at 9:15 a.m., and I met her at her office by 10 with the tablet and all 17 recordings backed up on 3 different cloud services and a physical drive I'd bought at an electronics store on my way across town. She'd been practicing family law for 16 years and had handled over 200 custody cases involving allegations of abuse, both legitimate and fabricated. I played her the first recording, and her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm within the first minute. She listened to 3 more recordings without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Then she stopped the playback and looked at me with the kind of seriousness that confirmed my worst fears. "Mr. Callahan, what you've discovered is evidence of parental alienation and conspiracy to file false reports with Child Protective Services. This is extremely serious, and you need to act immediately to protect yourself and your children. If your stepmother files a complaint before we can get ahead of this, you'll be on the defensive trying to prove a negative, which is much harder than being proactive with evidence of her coaching scheme." Rebecca explained that we needed to file for an emergency protective order removing Vivian from the home and prohibiting her from any contact with the children. She also recommended I contact a forensic psychologist who specialized in coaching detection to evaluate Sophie and Liam and document any psychological impact from Vivian's manipulation. We spent 4 hours in her office that day, developing a legal strategy and documenting everything on the recordings with timestamps and transcripts. Rebecca connected me with Dr. Alan Fitzgerald, a forensic psychologist who'd been working with families and courts for 22 years and had expertise in identifying coached testimony in children. He agreed to see us that same week for initial evaluations of both kids, explaining that the sooner we documented their current mental state and understanding of the coached narratives, the stronger our case would be if this went to court. Rebecca also recommended installing visible cameras in our common living areas and keeping a detailed log of all interactions with Vivian until we could legally remove her from the house. I went home that afternoon, feeling like I was walking into enemy territory, even though it was my own house that I'd been paying the mortgage on for 8 years. Vivian was in the kitchen making the kids an after-school snack, acting completely normal as if she hadn't spent the past month training my children to accuse me of abuse. Sophie ran up to hug me when I walked in, and I had to fight the urge to ask her about the recordings because Rebecca had warned me not to discuss any of this with the kids until Dr. Fitzgerald could do his evaluation. Instead, I made small talk about school and homework, while Vivian chatted about her plans to take the kids to the Science Museum over the weekend, playing the role of devoted grandmother so convincingly that I might have believed it myself if I hadn't heard her true voice on those recordings. That evening after dinner, I told Vivian we needed to talk privately in my office. She followed me with a pleasant smile, settling into the chair across from my desk, like we were just having a casual conversation. I pulled up the first recording on my computer and hit play, watching her face carefully as her own voice filled the room coaching Sophie to lie about being abandoned. The pleasant smile vanished immediately, replaced by an expression I'd never seen on her face before, something calculating and cold that made me wonder how I'd ever trusted this woman around my children. She let the recording play for maybe 20 seconds before interrupting with a laugh that sounded forced and brittle. This is taken completely out of context. We were practicing for a school play about family situations. Sophie's class is doing a unit on different types of families, and the teacher asked the children to role-play various scenarios. The lie was smooth and immediate, delivered with enough confidence that someone who hadn't listened to all 17 recordings might have believed her. But I'd heard every word, every coaching session, every conversation with Ms. Thornton about filing court documents, and there was no context that could explain away what she'd been doing. I played the fourth recording where she explicitly discussed the emergency custody petition and preparing the children to testify about abuse. Vivian's expression shifted again, the mask of confused innocence slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "You're misunderstanding what you're hearing. I've been concerned about your mental state since Natalie died, and I've been consulting with a family therapist about the best way to help the children process their trauma. If the recordings sound like coaching, it's because I was trying to help them articulate their real feelings about losing their mother and adapting to single-parent life. She was good. I had to give her that." Every accusation came with a plausible alternative explanation, each one designed to make me look paranoid or unstable for questioning her motives. But Rebecca had warned me this would happen, that people engaged in these kinds of schemes were often highly skilled at manipulation and gaslighting. I told Vivian that I'd consulted with an attorney and that she needed to leave our home immediately. Her response was to stand up and inform me calmly that she had every right to be there as a concerned family member, and that forcing her out would only demonstrate to the courts that I was erratic and potentially dangerous. She walked out of my office and went straight to the guest room she'd been occupying, closing the door firmly behind her. I called Rebecca immediately, and she explained that without a protective order, I couldn't legally force Vivian to leave since she'd established residency by living there for over a year. We'd have to wait until the emergency hearing scheduled for the following Monday, which meant spending the next 3 days living under the same roof as someone actively plotting to destroy my family. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I moved the tablet and all my backup drives to a safe deposit box at my bank to ensure Vivian couldn't access or destroy the evidence. I installed 3 visible cameras in the living room, kitchen, and playroom, telling Vivian they were for home security, but really wanting documentation of any further coaching attempts. I kept Sophie and Liam close whenever Vivian was around, making excuses about special daddy-daughter time and father-son projects that meant she couldn't get them alone for extended periods. She maintained her pleasant grandmother facade in front of the children, but when they weren't watching, her eyes followed me with an intensity that felt threatening, even though she never said or did anything overtly hostile. Dr. Fitzgerald conducted his evaluation on Friday afternoon, meeting with Sophie first, and then Liam in separate sessions at his office, while I waited in the reception area, trying not to pace holes in the carpet. The sessions lasted 2 hours each, during which he used age-appropriate games and questions to assess whether the children had been coached and what they actually believed versus what they'd been taught to say. When he finished, he asked me to join him in his office while an assistant supervised the kids in a play area. His expression was grave as he pulled out his preliminary notes and began explaining what he'd discovered during the evaluations. Both children show clear signs of having been subjected to systematic coaching about abuse allegations. Sophie in particular demonstrated what we call script awareness, meaning she knows she's been taught specific things to say, but doesn't fully understand why those statements are important or what consequences they might have. When I asked her direct questions about feeling scared of you, she couldn't provide specific examples, and her body language indicated confusion rather than genuine fear. Liam is younger, and his responses were less sophisticated, but he repeated certain phrases word for word that are characteristic of coached testimony, rather than organic child speech. Dr. Fitzgerald explained that he'd be completing a full written report over the weekend for submission to the court, and that in his professional opinion, the children had been psychologically manipulated, but had not yet internalized the false narrative as truth. The emergency hearing happened Monday morning at 9 a.m. in a small courtroom with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Judge Patricia Donnelly presided, a family court judge with 28 years on the bench and a reputation for not tolerating manipulation or false allegations. Rebecca presented the recordings along with Dr. Fitzgerald's preliminary evaluation and a timeline showing Vivian's gradual insertion into our household and her increasing control over the children's routines. The audio played in that courtroom with Vivian's voice filling the space, coaching my 6-year-old to lie about abandonment and fear, and I watched the judge's expression harden with each passing minute. Vivian's attorney tried to argue that the recordings were ambiguous and could be interpreted as legitimate therapeutic role-playing, but that defense crumbled when Rebecca played the conversation with Ms. Thornton discussing the emergency custody petition. Judge Donnelly asked Vivian directly if she'd been planning to file for custody, and after a long pause, her attorney advised her not to answer. The judge's response was immediate and decisive. She granted an emergency protective order removing Vivian from our home effective immediately, prohibited any contact with the children pending a full hearing, and ordered a comprehensive investigation by the county's Child Protective Services Division to determine if criminal charges should be filed for attempted filing of false reports. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Vivian had to collect her belongings from our house that afternoon under police supervision. She didn't speak to me during the entire process, just packed her clothes and personal items, while a uniformed officer stood in the doorway, ensuring she didn't take anything that didn't belong to her. The kids were at school during the removal, which was probably for the best, because I don't know how I would have explained to Sophie why Grandma was leaving under police supervision without getting into details about the coaching that they were too young to fully comprehend. When Vivian walked out the front door for the last time, she turned back and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not remorse or apology, but something closer to cold calculation, like she was already planning her next move. Child Protective Services assigned an investigator named Thomas Grayson, a 15-year veteran who'd worked hundreds of cases involving family allegations and custody disputes. He arrived at our house the next day for an inspection and interview, walking through every room and asking detailed questions about our daily routines, the children's schedules, my work hours, and my relationship with Vivian. I showed him the recordings in Dr. Fitzgerald's report, and he listened to everything with professional detachment before explaining that his investigation would take approximately 3 weeks and would include interviews with the children's teachers, our pediatrician, neighbors, and anyone else who had regular contact with our family. The investigation period felt like living under a microscope. Thomas Grayson showed up at unexpected times to observe me with the kids, watching how we interacted during breakfast or homework time. He interviewed Sophie's first-grade teacher, who reported that Sophie was a well-adjusted child who never showed signs of fear or anxiety about going home, which contradicted the narrative Vivian had been building. He spoke with our pediatrician, Dr. Nina Alvarez, who'd been seeing both kids since birth, and confirmed that she'd never observed any indicators of abuse or neglect in all her years treating them. He even talked to our neighbors, who told him I was a devoted single father who clearly prioritized his children despite the demands of running a business. During this time, I also discovered that Ms. Thornton was actually Vivian's attorney, a woman named Catherine Thornton, who specialized in grandparents' rights cases and had apparently been advising Vivian on how to build a custody case against me. Rebecca subpoenaed her records and found draft petitions for emergency custody that Vivian had been planning to file the week after I discovered the recordings. The documents alleged systematic emotional abuse, neglect of basic needs, and psychological damage that required immediate removal of the children from my care. Every allegation was based on the coach testimony Vivian had been drilling into Sophie and Liam for weeks, and if I hadn't found that tablet when I did, those petitions would have been filed, and I'd have been fighting to prove my innocence rather than exposing Vivian's scheme. The full custody hearing took place 6 weeks after the initial emergency order, and the courtroom was packed with witnesses on both sides. Vivian's attorney called several character witnesses who testified about her devotion to the children and her concerns about my capability as a single father. One of them was Vivian's sister, who claimed she'd witnessed me being short-tempered and dismissive with Sophie on multiple occasions. Another was a woman from Vivian's church who said she'd heard concerning things about how I left the kids alone for long periods. All of it was hearsay and opinion, none of it backed by actual evidence, but it was designed to create doubt about my fitness as a parent. Rebecca systematically dismantled their testimony with the recordings and the evidence we'd compiled. She called Dr. Fitzgerald to explain his findings about coach testimony and the psychological manipulation Vivian had subjected the children to for weeks. She called Thomas Grayson, who testified that his 3-week investigation had found zero evidence of abuse or neglect, and that all witnesses with direct knowledge of our family described me as an attentive and loving father. She called Dr. Alvarez, who stated firmly that both children were healthy, well cared for, and showed normal attachment patterns with their father. And then she played the recordings again, all 38 minutes of the longest coaching session, letting Vivian's own words demonstrate exactly what she'd been doing. Judge Donnelly took less than an hour to deliberate before issuing her ruling. She denied Vivian's custody petition entirely, made the protective order permanent with no contact allowed between Vivian and the children, and referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution for attempted filing of false reports and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge's statement from the bench was scathing, calling Vivian's actions a reprehensible abuse of the legal system and a betrayal of the trust these children placed in their grandmother. She noted that parental alienation through coaching was a form of psychological abuse in itself, and that Vivian had caused measurable harm to Sophie and Liam that would require therapy to address. The district attorney's office took 3 months to decide whether to file charges, during which time Vivian attempted multiple violations of the protective order. She showed up at Sophie's school twice, forcing the administration to call police and implement additional security protocols. She sent letters to our house that I had to turn over to authorities as evidence of contact violations. She even hired a private investigator to follow me and document my parenting, apparently still trying to build some kind of case despite having lost in court. Each violation resulted in additional penalties and fines, but she seemed unable to accept that she'd lost access to the children permanently. Eventually, the district attorney filed 3 charges: attempted filing of false reports with intent to defraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and child endangerment through psychological manipulation. The trial lasted a week, with much of the same evidence and testimony from the custody hearing presented to a jury. Vivian's defense was that she genuinely believed the children were in danger and had been trying to protect them, but that argument fell apart when the prosecution played the recordings of her explicitly instructing the kids to lie and coordinating with her attorney to file fabricated petitions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. Sentencing happened 2 months later. Vivian received 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, mandatory psychological counseling, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of me or the children. She also had to pay restitution for our legal fees, which totaled over $35,000 between the custody case and the criminal defense. Judge Donnelly could have given her jail time, but opted for probation given her age and lack of prior criminal record, though she made it clear that any violation of the protective order would result in immediate incarceration. Vivian left the courtroom without looking at anyone, escorted by her attorney who'd already filed an appeal despite the overwhelming evidence against her client. Sophie and Liam started therapy with Dr. Fitzgerald to address the coaching they'd been subjected to and help them understand what had happened in age-appropriate terms. The sessions revealed that both kids had been confused and stressed by Vivian's instructions to lie about me, creating internal conflict between what they knew was true and what their grandmother was telling them to say. Sophie admitted she'd had stomach aches before the planned interview with Ms. Thornton because she didn't want to lie but was scared of disappointing Grandma. Liam had started having nightmares about Daddy going away, not because of anything I'd done, but because Vivian had been telling him that's what would happen if he didn't say the right things to the lady who was going to visit. 18 months after I found those recordings on the tablet, our lives have settled into something that feels stable and normal in ways I wasn't sure we'd ever achieve again. Sophie is 8 now and thriving in 3rd grade, making friends and joining the art club without the burden of coached lies weighing on her conscience. Liam is 5 and started kindergarten this year, showing no lasting effects from the coaching beyond a healthy skepticism about adults who ask him to keep secrets. We talk about Mom sometimes, about the real Natalie who loved them and would never have wanted anyone to use them as pawns in legal schemes. I've kept the tablet as evidence in case Vivian ever tries anything again, though so far she's maintained the court-ordered distance. I hired a nanny through a professional agency with background checks and references, someone who helps with after-school care and summer breaks without trying to replace me as their parent. My architectural firm has adapted to accommodate single parenthood, with me delegating more responsibilities to my partners so I can maintain reasonable work hours and be present for school events and bedtimes. The house feels different without Vivian's presence, lighter somehow, like we can breathe without constantly performing for an invisible audience waiting to document our failures. I installed a security system not because I'm paranoid, but because I learned the hard way that trust without verification can be dangerous when dealing with people who have their own agendas. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.